Welcome to this video version of the BC COVID-19 Modeling Group Report. This is our 5th report being released on June 16th of 2021. In it, I will review some of our projections for the next month and discuss some current issues. So let me just remind you of who we are. The group consists of academics from University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, and the University of Victoria, as well as a few associated individuals with expertise in data analysis and modeling in general, or specifically in epidemiology and related areas. We're independent of the BC government and are doing this to provide an independent voice and independent analysis to supplement the efforts at the BC CDC and within the government itself. So here are the key messages for this report. First off, reopening at the end of May did not change the rapid decline in cases that we've been seeing. Next, the Delta cases seem to be steady, but the BC data on Delta has suffered from inconsistencies, and the recent changes to the process have complicated our ability to use it effectively. And estimates from elsewhere tell us that Delta grows faster than Alpha without question. And we should be concerned about the risk of seeing that here. We do expect to see some growth in Delta in the short term, but vaccination progress and other mitigation efforts could keep that growth slow or possibly even contained. And finally, first doses are slowing among the 40 and 50-year-old age cohorts, but the younger cohorts are getting vaccinated extremely rapidly, and that's great news, so bravo. Keep that up. And finally, we'll end this off with a mini tutorial on efficacy, just to answer some common questions that we hear from colleagues and friends. This slide is contributed by Jens von Bergman and provides a summary of the COVID-19 story to date. Cases continue to decline rapidly, despite concerns that reopening would allow for some growth. In fact, we're seeing very little impact or no impact of the reopening on the rate of decline, which is a bit surprising. It's possible that vaccination progress is counterbalancing reopening, but vaccination is a gradual process compared to the suddenness of a reopening, so it's still a bit mysterious why we haven't seen any bend or bump in the curve. So this slide shows Dean Carlin's model projections from our previous report with the new data inserted in red. You can see those data points here. You'll notice that for the most part, the data lies within the projected region, except we're now starting to fall out of it down here. This seems to be because the anticipation that the transmission rate would go back to what it was before measures were instituted on March 30th was incorrect. So the transmission rates now seem to be lower, even though we have done some reopening. And this is already accounting for vaccination in the model. So it's not clear exactly what factors underlie this, but there's definitely some difference from pre-circuit breaker measures on March 30th. This slide, also from Dean Carlin, shows model fits by health authority. So this first panel shows the data and model fit for all of British Columbia. And you'll notice in many of the health authorities, you see the same very consistent and encouraging decline. That's true in the interior and northern as well, except there was a brief interval here where the transmission rate underwent a significant change, and you can see that Dean's model picked up some kind of a measure change, even though there was none. This here does not correspond to reopening, and it identified something more like an outbreak or a burst of infections in the Northern Health Authority. So here is Sally Otto's update to the Delta variant numbers with the change from using screening to using just whole genome sequencing to track variant numbers, and the change from releasing aggregate B1617 numbers to just B1617.2 numbers, that's delta. The data shown as red dots here make growth estimates kind of murky. And we'll have to wait for better data to really determine if delta is growing yet here in BC. Fitting a growth curve to this data anyway, despite the sort of questions built into this data, it shows that we can't make any conclusive claims about what delta is doing quite yet. So it's possible that that delta is actually established and is just being kept under control now that cases are low and contact tracing could be more successful, or it could be that delta is just in that very early kind of stochastic period where cases don't really catch on and there haven't been any large transmission events that would give it a foothold. So given the murkiness of the recent delta numbers in BC, we decided to look to Alberta, where the VOC data has been more complete and a bit more consistent. Dean's and Sally's analysis of this data focused on estimating the selection coefficient of delta relative to alpha. That means quantifying how much faster delta is growing compared to alpha. For a refresher on how that's done, you can refer back to the previous report's video where I give a brief explanation. So Dean and Sally both find independently a 10% per day advantage of delta over alpha, which is on the upper end of estimates from the US and Europe described in our last report and reviewed again with updated data on our next slide. In Alberta, delta currently accounts for about 20% of cases, and we estimate a 2.6% per day growth rate. That corresponds to a 26-day doubling time, and that's an estimate that's before the recent reopening. So at this point, it's worth emphasizing an important modeling and assumption, and that is that when variants have different growth rates, it's critical to consider them as relatively independent epidemics. And I say relatively independent because obviously if there's cross-immunity, then people who've been sick with one variant are more resistant to the new variant. And if you've been vaccinated, it works for both. But the two, let's say alpha and delta particularly, the two growth rates for these variants are different enough that it's actually misleading to estimate a single reproductive number for both of them. So this is the now famous R value, right? Capital R value. And so this Alberta data illustrates this really nicely. So if you calculate an apparent reproductive number in Alberta for using all case data, forgetting that there's variance, you currently get a number that's certainly below 1, and that's consistent with the continual drop in cases that they've been seeing there. However, this approach completely misses a predictive opportunity, and that is because of sequencing, we can independently estimate the growth rate, like we're talking about here, of delta, and that delta still represents a relatively small portion of cases. So even though it's growing, the decline in alpha kind of swamps that out, and you end up seeing a reproductive number less than 1 that's corresponding just to the fact that alpha is sort of dominant in numbers and is the one that's decreasing. But hiding underneath it is a growing delta currently in Alberta. And so if you were to independently estimate an R value, a capital R value, the reproductive number for alpha and delta separately, you would find that the alpha reproductive number is actually smaller than the effective one that you would get for the whole epidemic, and that the delta R value is positive. And what we do expect, because what we're seeing here is a positive growth rate in delta, that we would in fact see in Alberta now that we have a positive R value. In other words, a positive reproductive number for the delta epidemic. It's sort of like a sub-epidemic that gets its own reproductive number. So this point applies equally well to BC, even though we're not able to directly estimate delta's current growth rate here, and it's difficult to say for sure whether delta is growing or decaying. It's important that we keep an eye on it and think in terms of estimating an R value for delta independent of the dominant alpha reproductive number. Here is Dean Carlin's update to his estimation of the delta selection coefficient. So these plots in blue behind me, as for the Alberta analysis on the previous slide, show the log of the ratio of delta cases to alpha cases in various US states. So the slope of these fitted lines behind me give the difference in their growth rates. And Dean's taken and collected those into the graph there on the left. And what you can see is that gamma, which is in gray, that's P1, that's this column here, has a slightly elevated growth rate relative to alpha. And as found in the previous report and for Alberta, delta has a higher larger growth advantage over alpha. So here it looks like it's between around 0.5 and, well, if you look at the data points, 0.5 and going up as high as about 12 or so. And Alberta fell in around here at 10%. So you can see that there's definitely a significant increase in the growth rate for delta compared to alpha. So this is a new slide from Dean Carlin. It gives a really nice glimpse under the hood of his model and also gives a means of explaining what could happen once delta established itself in BC. So the top graph here is just Dean's model fits broken down into the original virus case counts and the alpha plus gamma case counts. And then in red you see here just sort of an illustrative delta curve, which is supposed to illustrate what could happen, although the starting point is a little bit mysterious and it's not clear whether we've really started to have that initial growth that the model here would predict. Okay, so that's the top graph. The bottom graph is where all the interesting stuff is hiding. So that's where we get this glimpse under the hood. So at any time during the pandemic, there's a certain number of susceptible individuals, and that's given here in blue. They start off, 100% of the population is susceptible initially, and you can see, well, if you were to zoom in really close, you'd see that this is gradually decreasing as people build immunity from having been sick with COVID. Eventually, once we start vaccinating, we get a much more dramatic departure, and that's where we are right now, or well, we're here right now. We've brought down that susceptible fraction by about, I don't know what it is, maybe 30 or 40%. It's some fraction of the total number of people that have been vaccinated because of the efficacy of that for the first dose. So the lower curve, the second one that actually also comes in orange and green and red parts, is a slightly more complicated thing. So it's the product of a transmission rate parameter with the blue curve above. And that's essentially that's the rate at which new infections appear in the population. So when Dean fits his model to data, the algorithm decides on key moments when the transmission parameter changes. So you can see some of those changes here, right? In June or late May, early June of last year, it identified a transition in the transmission parameter right there, and that corresponded to a post-lockdown reopening. And then later in the fall, there was introduction of some measures, and then I think this one was not actually related. This may have been maybe seasonal changes or something like that. It wasn't related to measures. And then we had a lockdown as we approached mid-November, and that brought the transmission rate down to a lower level and so on. So first what the algorithm does is identifies where to put these transitions, and those tend to line up very closely with the introduction of measures. And then the next thing the algorithm does is estimates what the transmission parameter must have been like in between those breakpoints, and it does both of these two simultaneously to find the best fit of the model to the data. So what you see here initially, the susceptible fraction wasn't changing at all. So the assumption is that with measures in place, people were behaving relatively in a consistent way throughout each of these intervals, so you get a consistent, constant transmission rate. And then more recently, you have that behavioral constant sort of effect, but it's modulated by the decreasing susceptible fraction. So those plateaus now become rolling hills. And so what you see here is in the original variant, we were just below growth. So this gray line is a 0% growth. And so from late November until February, we were actually even further. There's a slight jump in there, but throughout this entire period, we were just barely below zero growth rate. And so the virus was just hovering. The cases were just kind of hovering and dropping a little bit. And then with the introduction of the alpha variant, we had the beginning of a new transmission rate. And so Dean introduced a new parameter into the model, which was the alpha transmission rate. And so from then on, you see both of them occurring, and you can see alpha takes over from the original virus. And on May 30th or soon after, the model identifies that breakpoint where we had that circuit breaker kind of lockdown or new measures, where it brought both those transmission rates down quite significantly, and it brought down the alpha one more than the original virus, and that we saw in the selection coefficient as that kink. Then vaccination started having an effect, and it brought that alpha growth rate even further negative. And what we are seeing now is this sort of mysterious introduction of a new variant, the Delta variant, which Dean is representing here with these red curves. And the growth advantage of Delta over Alpha is sort of visible in this plot here as the jump between these curves. Now, we're not too sure yet if it's 0.05, 0.07, or 0.09, but each of these curves illustrate what happens in each of those scenarios. So this is where we are right now, and we're now just saying, suppose we have Delta present and growing, we have community spread that's not kept in check by, let's say, contact tracing or whatever is currently holding it in check. And our estimates indicate that nothing really should be holding it in check as far as we can tell. So we may start seeing that exponential growth because all three of these curves are above zero. If we're in the most optimistic scenario, we should see the vaccination bring that rate down fairly soon. But if we're in the most pessimistic situation, we should see a positive growth rate in alpha throughout the summer. This is going up until August. So I would say it's really critical that we watch the Delta numbers. I mean, maybe reopening is a dangerous thing if we're looking at, absolutely keeping open for weeks without reconsidering. But if we watch closely and we can figure out if we're in this lower scenario or this upper scenario, we'll have a much better idea of how risky it is to continue the reopening program that we've started on already. And really, time will tell as we see more data, and this is why it's so critical that we get some really clear data on how Delta is doing, that we can actually fit these growth curves so that we have a BC relevant number and we can figure out which of these three scenarios. And you can see, based on the fact that they each cross at a very different point this summer, in fact not cross even as of August, that the impact of this estimate has big implications for what our summer can look like. Okay, so this is my favorite slide of any of the ones that we've produced in these reports. So hopefully that makes sense, and I'll go on with the next few slides. So here we have an update from Elisha Are and Carolyn Kaline, and they are showing a continued decline in cases, although at a decreasing rate. And this is not taking into account, for example, the Delta variant, which, as I've discussed at length already, is still a little bit ambiguous. But basically what we're seeing here is an independent model from the other ones that we've seen already, indicating that this ongoing decline is not so surprising, and that the models are predicting predicting this the scenario that we're seeing. So here is Bryn Wiley's update on vaccination progress. So we've got new color coding. Red shades are first doses and green shades are second doses. And you can see the older cohorts are getting close to closing the circle. We're looking really good for the first doses, and second doses are starting to come along, which is good. And take a look at these youngsters. Look at this. All of this here, all this orange here, and all this orange here in the, what's that? That's, I guess, 12 to 29 age cohorts. That's all in the last week and a half. So that's really great progress, and lots of optimism for getting a high vaccination rate among the youth, which is terrific for inching us up towards herd immunity, even though that's a difficult goal to achieve. So I'm going to skip over a few of these slides on herd immunity, very similar to what I discussed, similar slides to the last time round. And here is just a quick second view on vaccination. So what you see here, this is Jens van Bergman's assembly of the vaccination data. So this part here is again the same, and what you can see up here in the inset is just a comparison of Israel, the US, and the UK, all their progress on first doses in light green and second doses in dark green. And you can see that although we're lagging behind significantly in second doses, we are really doing well in first doses, which is a good indicator that we may be eventually a world leader in vaccination rate across the whole population. So that's very good news, and has great implications for our ability to keep this COVID pandemic under control locally. Okay, so now we get to the vaccine efficacy primer. So we included this in the report because questions that we've heard and misconceptions that we've seen about what efficacy actually means. So efficacy is what's measured in the vaccination trials, and let's say a particular vaccine is 80% effective. So what does that mean? So imagine you and your friend do everything together, and only one of you are fully vaccinated, your friend is not. What can we say about the situation? When there's an 80% effectiveness or efficacy, that means that your friend is 5 times more likely than you are to get COVID-19. There's no absolute statement there, right? This 80% describes your relative risk. I don't know how likely your friend is to get sick. I don't know how likely you are, but I know there's a factor of 5 difference in that risk. And so when COVID is at low prevalence, you'll both have a low chance of getting sick with COVID. When it's at a high prevalence, you'll have a higher chance, but in both situations, you'll be 5 times less likely to get it. So let's take a look at some common interpretations of what an 80% effective vaccine means. And I'm going to list off a bunch of things that are incorrect. So the first one, you are 80% protected. That's kind of a vague statement, not clear what it means, but it's definitely not correct. The flip of that, which maybe is a little bit easier to see as incorrect, is that you have a 20% chance of getting COVID-19. So that, again, there's no notion of relativeness here, and certainly if COVID-19 is at very low prevalence, that's 20% is really unrealistic, way too high a chance. And if it's at very high prevalence, it's still not likely to be correct. It's going to be completely dependent on that prevalence. What we need to do is compare relative chances of somebody vaccinated with not vaccinated. Okay, next one. Each time you get exposed to someone with COVID-19, you have a 1 in 5 chance of getting infected. No, each time you're exposed to someone with COVID-19, there's a chance that you'll get infected, and if you're vaccinated, that chance goes down by 1/5. So this statement is also incorrect. So out of 100 vaccinated people like you, 20% of them will get COVID-19. No. Again, there's a missing piece here. If you knew how many people normally unvaccinated would get sick out of those 100, 1/5 of those you would expect would get sick in the case where those people are now vaccinated. Next one, if you get COVID, your symptoms will only be 20% as severe. So that 20%, now it's true that the severity will be less, and there's good evidence that the hospitalization rate among vaccinated individuals is lower, but 20% is not the meaningful number there. Next one, 80% of the time I encounter somebody with COVID, I'm protected. I'm at risk 20% of the time. So it seems pretty clear. This is a possible interpretation, but the biology doesn't seem to work out that way. So it's not as though each time you meet someone, the vaccine decides, am I going to be effective or not effective? It's more that you have an immune response that's sitting there waiting for incoming virus, and it can have a better chance of dealing with it when it happens. So it's not an on or off experience or an on and off event. The last one, which is a little bit true, I got vaccinated so I can safely behave as normal with little risk of infection. So this is always going to be relative to other factors, right? So if you're engaging in low risk activities, few people around, social distancing going on, wearing a mask, in well ventilated indoor areas or outdoor areas, then yeah, that's pretty safe. But just because you have 1/5 the chance of getting infected doesn't mean that chance is low if you're engaging in high risk activities. So that's clarifying some of the details of what you can and can't assume about what a vaccine that's 80% effective means. If you want more details on sort of the math underlying it, you can take a look at the report, and we have an extra slide with a little bit of the math in the appendix for those who are interested. So we have an exciting update on genome data. So BC has now started uploading genome data to the GISAID global database. If you read the fine print in this and our other reports, you'll have noticed that some of our work has relied on data uploaded by other jurisdictions, but BC had been lagging. Over 9,000 full genomes from BC are now in the database. That's just in the last little while. So this data it's great that it's there. It'll help our own and international efforts to identify new variants, estimate rates of spread of variants, detect importations, and so on. All really exciting stuff for the data geeks among us. So thanks to all those who are involved in making that data happen and getting it public. And in the last slide, I will close with a quick recap. So first off, our recent reopening did not derail our steady decline in cases. Pushing vaccination progress as far as possible will be critical in managing Delta and inevitable other variants of concern that are yet to arise. So evidence for a 10 to 50 or 5 to 10%, hold on, let me say that again. Evidence for a 5 to 10% per day faster spread rate of Delta is clear from other jurisdictions, but in BC, we don't yet have enough data to confirm that rate locally. It's certainly, we expect that's going to be the case, but it'll be great to know and gauge exactly what's going on here. And finally, hooray for data sharing. Okay, so that is our report for June 16th, and we will most likely have another report coming out in a couple weeks, but depending on how things go, we may push that back a little bit further, just because hopefully things are really boring for the next couple weeks. Okay, take care and be safe.